Texture. Can you guys see that all right? You can turn your mic on for just a second and tell me,
Yes.
because I can't. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I can see it.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Good. Sorry, I just need a little verification. Texture. Most of us understand what it is. It's like if your eyeballs had fingertips, right? It's like actual or simulated surface quality, right? Like here's a Magritte painting I thought was a really great example of textures. Like he's simulating these natural textures in his painting. So we can almost reach out with our eyeballs and feel that gravel on the ground, or the boards and kind of rough wood grain texture on them. So like that texture is just such an interesting kind of spice to add to your work. Here are a few of the ideas associated with texture. So texture, the surface quality of a two-dimensional shape or three-dimensional volume. It can be tactile or visual or both. So again, it's like touching with your eyeballs. There's a really important aspect to any of the elements of design, and especially texture, and that's value, right? Lights and darks are really how we differentiate different surface qualities. And like one thing to note as a kind of practical matter with texture is that it's sometimes hard to distinguish it from a pattern, right? A repeating motif will put us in the mind of texture. And so there's a close relationship between pattern and texture that you need to be aware of and kind of use to your advantage. On the right, we see impasto oil paint applied to a canvas. Down below, we see like scratches and marks made onto a surface. Each one of these things is an example of a kind of, in this case, fairly aggressive texture in artwork. Actual texture. Here's one of our kind of distinguishing characters associated with texture that we need to kind of be aware of. And so actual texture is literally experienced through the sense of touch. It's not a visual simulation, it's the real deal, like actual texture. So if I threw a ball of twine to you right now, you would feel that rough texture. It's like really there. It's not a simulation, it's the actual texture. And in your work, you can use actual textures. Like Robert Rauschenberg, like when he ran out of art supplies, he decided to turn his bed into a work of art. So literally all of the textures from his quilt and his sheets and his pillow, he put together as a work of art and splashed a little paint on it. Voila. Like if we were to see this thing in person, it would be the real surfaces, the real textures, actual texture. Okay. Sculpture in particular, like relief sculpture, is an example of a more two-dimensional sculpture. So the third example here over on the right is 2D art. The first two are actually three-dimensional, but all of them have actual textures that have been carved into the surface of wood or stone. Things you could actually reach out, not just with your eyes, but with your hands, feel that texture, actual texture. And then paint, right? George Rouault, Lucian Freud, both known for applying very thick brushwork to their canvases. I don't recommend that you go to the museum and use your hands to feel these things because the art guard will be very upset with you. But again, there's real actual texture involved in these works of art, okay? And you don't need me to tell you this, but I just pointed out that there's a distinction between the real thing and a simulation of it. And you need to be aware of that in your own work. What are the possibilities? All right, and so here we go. It's simulated texture, a detailed imitation of an object's surface. It mimics the real texture, but on a two-dimensional surface, right? The suggestion of a texture. And so one of the ways that artists do this is with trompe-l'oeil, right, which literally translates to fool the eye. And so if you can paint with an incredible deal of illusion, you can simulate these textures and make people believe that that texture is there, but it's just an illusion. It's just a simulation. I remember when I was in grad school, one of my visiting professors was a trompe l'oeil painter and brought in one of his pieces one day, and literally it was like a piece of tape holding a photograph onto a flat surface, and we were all fooled. Like, he had painted that piece of tape so accurately that you felt like you could walk right up to it and peel it off the surface. And so these trompe l'oeil paintings simulate texture. It's not the actual texture, it's just a simulation, right? Again, if you're a really detailed, observant painter, you can suggest texture with great facility and fool the eye. Another simulated texture that, again, we don't actually feel it, but we see it and it looks like it's got that surface quality, is through transfers like screen printing and photo transfers. Here's another Rauschenberg where he has silk screened these different images onto a canvas or panel that really give the piece a sense of texture. It's kind of dirty and messy and smeared, and it's broken down. Like, if we were to touch it, it seems like we'd be able to feel that, but it's really just a simulation. It's flat as a pancake. And so here's a Robert Mars, like he's using transfers over the top of collage, and it has a certain texture to it. It's one thing that you can do in Photoshop very easily. If you throw a certain filter effect on a photograph in Photoshop so that it looks like a Xerox transfer, you can generate texture in a digital image the same way, in a similar way. Again, you're just simulating that texture. Another way to simulate texture is through creating rubbings, sometimes referred to by artists as frottage. And so, like, you've done this, you did this when you were a kid. You put a piece of paper over a textured surface and then run your pencil or crayon across it to capture a simulation of that surface. And this is one of the strategies that you can employ when you're creating your digital collage. I want all of you to figure out a way to simulate a texture by your own hand. And this is one of the ways you can do it. Find a rough texture, put a piece of paper down, create a rubbing of it, and then photograph it and get it into Photoshop. That's one way you can do it. Here's an artist named Stephen Talasnik who creates these rubbings and then embellishes the lines that he finds on these textures and creates these kind of armature kind of structures that were kind of inspired by that rubbing, that frottage. Really kind of interesting. And here's Max Ernst, the great artist from the early part of the 20th century. His whole thing was like creating these automatic images that were derived from texture. He would take two panels and put paint on one and transfer it from one to the other, and that would create this kind of symmetrical texture, and he would use that as inspiration. He would find images within these kind of accidental textures. And here's one where he's kind of taken these different rubbings and formulated a bird from that. So interesting. Okay, so papier-collé, collage, two other ways of creating surface texture. And basically this was invented by Braque and Picasso in their studio, first part of the 20th century. They were making paintings and still life, essentially were slapping actual objects onto those surfaces. And voila, collage was born. This is Picasso and Juan Gris, the examples of taking actual two-dimensional objects and pasting them into a drawing or painting. It creates a certain texture, not just like a visual pattern, like say from this wallpaper on the right-hand side, but like the paper itself sits up on the surface and creates a textural quality. And then, the written text, it has a pattern to it that creates a sense of texture as well. Here's a Romare Bearden. He's taking photographs and cutting them out and reassembling an image using them. This, just the act of gluing these things down. So it's not just a pictorial construct, but the byproduct is this texture that is really interesting to our eye. All right, so you can simulate natural textures, like here's a digital image where texture of rippling water is duplicated and reversed and blended together in such a way to create a kind of symmetry. The resulting texture is even more intensified. So it's a natural texture that's simulated. It's not the real thing, but it is a simulation of it. Right? Here's Andrew Wyeth's great painting, Christina's World. Again, this is egg tempera painting, and byproduct is like really nice, thin lines that suggest the field of grass, and her hair has the same kind of quality. So he's, again, it's not actual texture, it's a simulation of a naturally occurring texture. Texture can be abstract, right? Like we can look at those actual textures and create a simplified, rearranged version of that texture. Here's a Picasso where he's simulating and abstracting the texture of fur, right, or feathers. Here's a Roy Lichtenstein where he, again, is abstracting the texture of boards, cut wood, right, like wood grain texture. Simplified, like abstract, remember, just means a simplified version of a real thing. You can also invent textures, and this may be another strategy for you, is to create your own texture, kind of out of your own head. Here are a series of invented textures where we're just like repeating shapes, like a pattern, a repeating motif can create a texture. So that may be another strategy you can employ for your own collage. And then, of course, the materials that artists use will create textures. Never underestimate how important the material choices that you make affect your work of art. A work of art is nothing if not an expression of the media that you choose. And so the medium will, by its very qualities, create textures that are unique to that material. That's about it. That's texture in a nutshell. Just some, kind of almost like, here are the different kinds of textures. Like, have that in mind. We all know what texture is. Your job is to kind of think about it in a strategic way. I do want to remind everybody that texture is one of those things that can be very overwhelming. It's like one ingredient that if you got too much of it, it'll really overpower everything else. So it's important that you think, as you're developing your works of art, your designs that incorporate a lot of texture, that there is the need for positive and negative space in your consideration. If you cover every square inch with texture, there's a good chance you're going to overwhelm your viewers on. Controlling, where that texture falls and what it contrasts with, what it harmonizes with, it's very important that you kind of use it judiciously. Really think about what you're doing. Don't just slap it down and think, oh, well, that's a nice texture. Like, where are you going to emphasize that texture? And what other textures will you contrast it with? If you have some rough textures and some smooth textures within the same work of art, you can contrast things and control them in such a way that you're really using them in an efficient, effective way. All right, so there you have it. Texture.